The United States spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. It has the most powerful navy in human history, unmatched global reach, and military technology no one else can replicate. And yet, in the Caribbean Sea, America's own backyard, a single oil tanker refused to surrender, and the Coast Guard didn't have the resources to board it. This isn't about Venezuela. This isn't about sanctions. This is about the moment the world discovered that American power might be wider than it is deep. This is not sensationalism. This is system analysis. Let me show you who's really being targeted. Somewhere in the Caribbean, a tanker called the Bella 1 is drifting. Picture the scene from a helicopter view, a massive vessel cutting through blue water, American Coast Guard ships circling at a distance, unable to approach. The Bella 1 is on the U.S. Treasury sanctions list. It's carrying Venezuelan crude oil bound for China, and it has refused to allow boarding. The Coast Guard is waiting for reinforcements. Specialized maritime security response teams, elite units trained to rappel from helicopters onto moving decks, are not nearby. They're stretched across the globe, handling other missions, other crises, other priorities. Days pass. The tanker keeps moving. The Trump administration called this an unprecedented pressure campaign. Officials used words like blockade and quarantine. But when confronted with a single defiant ship, the machinery of American enforcement ground to a halt. Here's the number that should disturb you. The United States has announced it will interdict vessels violating Venezuelan sanctions across an area of roughly 6 million square nautical miles. To patrol this effectively would require resources the Coast Guard simply doesn't have. The gap between announcement and execution is not a minor discrepancy. It's a canyon. Captain Luis Mendoza still remembers the exact moment he understood something had changed. He was 53 years old, standing on the bridge of a Venezuelan oil tanker in late 2024, watching American patrol boats appear on the horizon. For 28 years, he'd transported crude across these waters. He'd seen American power up close, the helicopters, the boarding teams, the overwhelming force that made resistance unthinkable. But this time, he noticed something different. The patrol boats kept their distance. They circled. They waited. And then after 6 hours, they withdrew. Mendoza told his first mate, "They're not as strong as they look." That observation is now spreading through shipping channels across the world. And once adversaries believe American bark is worse than its bite, they test American resolve more frequently. This is the hidden cost of the Bella 1 standoff, not the oil that reached China, but the perception that reached everyone else. What most people get wrong about this crisis is thinking it's about Venezuela. It's not. Nicolas Maduro is a convenient villain, and his government makes an easy target for American sanctions. But Venezuela is the stage, not the play. The real confrontation is between Washington and Beijing over a question that will define the next 50 years. Can the United States still control access to resources in the Western Hemisphere? China is Venezuela's largest oil customer. Despite American sanctions, Chinese companies have continued purchasing Venezuelan crude, providing Caracas with an economic lifeline worth billions annually. Chinese firms have invested an estimated $60 billion in Venezuelan infrastructure, oil fields, and loans over the past 2 decades. This is not charity. This is strategic positioning. Here's the first question you need to sit with if American sanctions are supposed to isolate Venezuela. Why is Venezuela's largest trading partner getting stronger, not weaker? Zhang Wei still remembers the exact moment he realized his company had become a target. He was 47, a logistics manager at a Chinese state-owned energy firm in Shenzhen, reviewing shipping manifests on a Tuesday morning when his phone rang. A colleague in Singapore told him that one of their contracted tankers had been flagged by American authorities. The cargo was Venezuelan crude. The destination was Guangdong province. The message was clear: continue this trade and face consequences. Zhang spent 3 hours in emergency meetings. By evening, his company had rerouted the shipment through intermediaries that American tracking systems couldn't easily follow. They want to cut us off, Zhang told his wife that night. So we build new roads. That phrase, "we build new roads," captures China's entire response to American pressure. Alternative shipping routes, alternative payment systems, alternative international institutions. Every American sanction accelerates Chinese efforts to create a parallel global infrastructure that doesn't depend on American permission. Meanwhile, in Houston, the consequences flow in a different direction. Marcus Thompson still remembers the exact moment his refinery went quiet. He was 39, a shift supervisor at a facility that had processed Venezuelan heavy crude for 15 years. When sanctions tightened, the supply vanished. The refinery tried to pivot to other sources, but the economics didn't work. Venezuelan crude was uniquely suited to their equipment. Within 18 months, the facility reduced operations by 40%. Marcus took a pay cut of $23,000 annually to keep his job. 200 of his colleagues weren't as lucky. "We were told sanctions would hurt them," Marcus said, gesturing toward a map of Venezuela on his office wall. "Nobody mentioned they'd hurt us too." The winners and losers of this confrontation don't align with the official narrative. American refiners suffer. Chinese state companies adapt. Venezuelan elites find workarounds. And ordinary workers in Texas, in Caracas, in Shenzhen, absorb the costs of a conflict they didn't choose. Here's the second question that should challenge everything you've been told. If American sanctions are designed to change Venezuelan behavior, why have they been in place for nearly a decade without achieving that goal? At what point does a policy stop being a strategy and start being a ritual? The answer begins with something called long-armed jurisdiction, the American practice of applying U.S. laws extraterritorially, reaching across borders to punish foreign companies operating in international waters. China calls this an abuse of power. The United States calls it essential to national security. But behind this legal argument is a deeper fight over whether we still live in a unipolar world where American preferences become global rules. The Monroe Doctrine declared the Western Hemisphere off-limits to outside powers in 1823. For 2 centuries, that doctrine held. The Soviets challenged it once with Cuba, and we came within hours of nuclear war. Now China is challenging it again. Not with missiles, with money, with oil tankers, with the patience of a civilization that thinks in centuries. And the question nobody in Washington wants to answer is whether America can still enforce a doctrine written when China was a crumbling empire and the Caribbean was an American lake. The Bella One is still out there, and what happens next will tell us more about the future of American power than any speech, any summit, or any election. The Monroe Doctrine is still out there, encoded in American strategic thinking like an operating system most people have forgotten was installed. And China is testing whether it still runs. To understand what's happening in the Caribbean right now, you need to understand a mechanism that most people have never heard of, but that shapes global trade every single day. It's called extraterritorial jurisdiction, or as Beijing puts it with calculated contempt, long-armed jurisdiction. Here's how it works in plain language. The United States passes a law saying you cannot trade with Venezuela. That law applies to American companies, which makes sense. But then Washington extends it further. Any company anywhere in the world that touches the American financial system uses dollars, clears transactions through American banks, or has American shareholders is also subject to that law. Violate it, and the United States can freeze your assets, block your access to dollar markets, and effectively exile you from the global economy. Think of it like this. Imagine your neighbor decides he doesn't like the family 3 streets over. So he tells you, if you talk to them, if you sell them groceries, if you let your kids play with their kids, he'll cut off your electricity. You'd say that's insane, he doesn't control your electricity. But what if he does? What if every wire in the neighborhood runs through his house? That's the position of the United States in global finance. The dollar is the wire. Nearly 90% of international trade is conducted in dollars. Almost every major bank in the world needs access to the American financial system to function. When Washington says, "Don't trade with Venezuela," it's not a request. It's an ultimatum backed by the most powerful economic infrastructure on Earth. Dr. Elena Vargas still remembers the exact moment she understood how deep this control runs. She was 41, a trade economist at a university in Sao Paulo, reviewing transaction data for a research paper when she noticed something strange. Brazilian companies were refusing contracts with Venezuelan partners, even though Brazilian law imposed no such restriction. When she called contacts in the banking sector, they explained it quietly. Their American correspondent banks had made clear that any Venezuela-linked transactions would trigger compliance reviews. No threats, no formal sanctions, just the implication that access to dollar clearing might become complicated. The weapon isn't the bullet, Elena told her graduate students the following week. The weapon is making sure everyone knows you have a gun. This mechanism has been remarkably effective for decades. But it depends on one critical assumption that there is no alternative. As long as the dollar is the only game in town, American financial power is absolute. The moment alternatives emerge, that power begins to erode. And here's the first question you should be asking. What happens when someone builds a different wire? China has been building alternative infrastructure for 15 years. The Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, launched in 2015, allows transactions in yuan without touching American banks. It's not yet a replacement for the dollar system, but it's growing. In 2023, CIPS processed over $14 trillion in transactions, up from essentially zero a decade earlier. Picture a graph showing this growth, a line that barely registers in 2015, then curves upward year after year, approaching a trajectory that would have seemed impossible when American financial dominance was unquestioned. What most people get wrong about this competition is thinking it's about ideology. It's not. It's about options. Venezuela doesn't care whether it gets paid in dollars or yuan. It cares about getting paid. Chinese companies don't care about challenging American hegemony. They care about accessing oil without risking their assets. The shift away from dollar dominance isn't driven by anti-American sentiment. It's driven by the rational calculation of actors who want to reduce their vulnerability to a system controlled by someone else. Remember Zhang Wei from Part 1, the logistics manager in Shenzhen, whose company rerouted Venezuelan oil shipments to avoid American tracking. His firm didn't switch to yuan payments out of patriotism. They switched because their legal team calculated that dollar exposure created unacceptable risk. Every sanction, every seized tanker, every frozen account pushes more companies toward the same conclusion. American financial weapons are so effective in the short term that they accelerate their own obsolescence in the long term. Now let me show you the other side of this mechanism. The part that explains why Europe is silent. During the Cold War, American confrontations with Soviet influence had full NATO backing. When Kennedy blockaded Cuba in 1962, European allies supported the action despite the risk of nuclear war. That solidarity was automatic, reflexive, built into the architecture of Western alliance. This time is different. Heinrich Müller still remembers the exact moment he realized Germany wouldn't follow Washington into this fight. He was 62, a senior policy advisor in Berlin's foreign ministry, sitting in a conference room in early 2024 as American officials presented their Venezuela strategy. The Americans wanted European sanctions coordination, joint enforcement, a unified front against Chinese economic aggression in the Western Hemisphere. Heinrich watched his colleagues' faces. Polite attention, careful notes, and underneath the unmistakable expression of people who had already decided to do nothing. After the meeting, his minister put it bluntly, "We spent 2 years rebuilding our energy relationships after Russia. We're not going to damage our China trade for a crisis in America's backyard that doesn't threaten us." European silence isn't betrayal, it's calculation. German exports to China totaled over 100 billion in 2023. French luxury goods, Italian machinery, Dutch semiconductors all depend on Chinese markets. When Europeans look at the Venezuela standoff, they see risk without reward. Supporting American sanctions means angering Beijing. And Beijing has leverage that Washington doesn't, the ability to grant or deny access to the fastest-growing consumer market in human history. Here's the second question that should reframe your understanding: if America's closest allies won't support this confrontation, what does that tell us about the actual distribution of global power? The answer is uncomfortable. American dominance was never just about military strength or financial infrastructure. It was about the perception that American leadership served everyone's interests. That perception is fracturing, not because America has weakened dramatically, but because alternatives have emerged, and other powers are calculating that following Washington's lead no longer offers the best return on investment. Let me give you one more human story that captures this shift. Maria Santos still remembers the exact moment her country chose a different path. She was 36, a trade negotiator for the Brazilian government, sitting in a windowless room in Brasilia during discussions about whether to join American sanctions on Venezuela. The pressure was intense, implied threats about trade preferences, hints about future cooperation, the full weight of American diplomatic machinery. But the numbers told a different story. China had become Brazil's largest trading partner 5 years earlier. Chinese investment in Brazilian agriculture, mining, and infrastructure exceeded $70 billion. When Maria's team ran the calculations, the conclusion was clear: aligning with Washington on Venezuela would cost more than it would gain. Brazil abstained. "We used to orbit Washington," Maria said later. "Now we have options." Options. That single word explains more about the current crisis than any amount of strategic theory. For decades, the United States could enforce its preferences because there were no alternatives. Now there are. And every country in the world is recalculating. The Monroe Doctrine declared the Western Hemisphere off-limits to outside powers when outside powers couldn't offer what America offered. Now China can match American investment, exceed American demand for commodities, and provide financial infrastructure that doesn't come with American conditions. The doctrine isn't being challenged by military force. It's being outbid, and the bidding war is about to escalate into something neither side can easily control. The Monroe Doctrine isn't being challenged by military force. It's being outbid, and what comes next reveals how the game is actually played, not on aircraft carriers, but in boardrooms, shipping lanes, and the quiet calculations of people who understand that power flows to those who can deliver what others need. Let me show you what's really happening behind the headlines. The official story goes like this. The United States is enforcing sanctions against a corrupt Venezuelan regime to promote democracy and human rights. American naval power is being deployed to prevent sanctioned oil from reaching global markets. This is about principles, about rules-based international order, about holding authoritarian governments accountable. Now let me show you the reality. In 2023, the United States quietly granted Chevron a license to resume oil operations in Venezuela. The American energy giant had maintained skeletal operations there for years, waiting for exactly this moment. Within months, Venezuelan crude was flowing again, not to China, but to American refineries. The same heavy crude that sanctions were supposed to keep off the market was suddenly acceptable, as long as American companies controlled it and American refineries processed it. Pause for a moment and consider what this means. The sanctions were never about keeping Venezuelan oil out of global markets. They were about keeping Venezuelan oil out of Chinese hands. When American companies can profit, the oil flows. When Chinese companies try to purchase, the Navy intervenes. This is not cynicism. This is documented policy. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Commander Sarah Mitchell still remembers the exact moment the contradiction became undeniable. She was 44, a Coast Guard officer stationed in the Caribbean, reviewing interdiction orders on a humid evening in late 2024. Her team had spent 3 weeks tracking a tanker carrying Venezuelan crude toward Chinese ports. They'd logged thousands of miles, burned hundreds of thousands of dollars in fuel, coordinated with multiple agencies. Then new orders came through, stand down. The tanker's cargo had been purchased by an intermediary connected to a licensed American company. The same oil, the same Venezuelan regime, the same sanctions supposedly in effect, but now untouchable. Sarah stared at the screen for a long time. "We're not enforcing sanctions," she told her executive officer. "We're enforcing market share." That phrase should stay with you. We're enforcing market share, because it captures the hidden logic of this entire confrontation. Here's the first question you need to answer for yourself. If sanctions are about principles, why do they have carve-outs for American profits? The answer is uncomfortable. American foreign policy operates on two levels simultaneously. The public level speaks the language of democracy, human rights, international law. The operational level speaks the language of strategic advantage, resource control, and great power competition. Both levels are real. But when they conflict, the operational level wins. What most people get wrong about great power competition is thinking it's about ideology. The Cold War conditioned us to see global conflicts as battles between systems: capitalism versus communism, freedom versus tyranny. But the US-China confrontation isn't ideological. Both countries operate mixed economies. Both have authoritarian elements and market elements. The competition is simpler and older. It's about who controls access to resources, shipping lanes, and the infrastructure of global trade. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Iran, larger than Russia. Control over Venezuelan oil isn't about Venezuelan democracy. It's about whether Chinese energy security can be held hostage to American naval power. Now let me show you who pays the price for this competition. Rosa Delgado still remembers the exact moment her family's grocery store went dark. She was 57, running the same small shop in Caracas that her mother had opened 40 years earlier. When American sanctions tightened in 2019, her suppliers couldn't get dollars to import goods. Shelves emptied. Prices exploded. Her savings, $12,000, carefully accumulated over 3 decades, became worthless within months as inflation spiraled beyond control. Rosa sold the store for the equivalent of $400 in late 2021. "They say they want to help us," she told a journalist who asked about American policy. "But we're the ones starving." Picture a split screen. On one side, Rosa's empty shelves in Caracas. On the other, Chevron executives in Houston announcing record quarterly profits from their newly licensed Venezuelan operations. The sanctions didn't change the regime. They changed who profits from Venezuelan misery. This is the rage moment. This is what the policy actually produces. American sanctions have been in effect for nearly a decade. Nicolás Maduro is still in power. The Venezuelan elite the people sanctions supposedly target have adapted. They use intermediaries, shell companies, cryptocurrency. They vacation in Turkey and the UAE. They send their children to European universities. The people who cannot adapt, who cannot escape, who have no options, they absorb the cost. Malnutrition rates among Venezuelan children tripled between 2017 and 2022. Maternal mortality doubled. 3 million people fled the country. Not regime officials, ordinary people. And here's what should make you question everything you've been told. American policymakers know this. The data is not hidden. The humanitarian catastrophe is documented by the UN, by human rights organizations, by American government agencies themselves. The policy continues because Venezuelan suffering is considered acceptable, perhaps even useful, as long as it prevents Chinese energy security. Remember Marcus Thompson from Part 1, the refinery supervisor in Houston, who took a $23,000 pay cut when Venezuelan crude stopped flowing. Here's what he doesn't know. Chevron's licensed operations are shipping Venezuelan crude to different American refineries, ones that didn't need to lay off workers because they had the right political connections to get exemptions. Same oil, same sanctions, different outcomes depending on who you know. The second question you should be asking: who designed this system and who benefits from its contradictions? Let me show you another human story that reveals the answer. James Chen still remembers the exact moment he understood how the game works. He was 38, a compliance officer at a Singapore-based shipping company, reviewing a contract for Venezuelan crude transport in early 2024. The cargo would go to China, technically a sanctions violation. But the contract included an elaborate structure. The oil would be purchased by a Dubai intermediary, transferred to a Liberian-flagged vessel, and delivered to a Malaysian port before final shipment to Guangdong. Each step added cost. Each step employed lawyers, bankers, logistics specialists, a small army of professionals whose job is to navigate the gap between announced policy and actual practice. James calculated that the sanctions compliance premium added roughly $8 per barrel. Not a barrier, a toll. Sanctions don't stop trade, James explained. They tax it, and the tax goes to people like me. This is the hidden economy of great power competition. Thousands of professionals in Dubai, Singapore, Hong Kong, and London who specialize in making prohibited transactions technically permissible. The trade continues. The oil flows. But now it flows through intermediaries who extract fees at every step. Sanctions don't isolate Venezuela. They enrich the people who know how to work around them. The real winners aren't in Washington or Beijing. They're in the gray zones between the lawyers, the bankers, the shell company specialists who profit from complexity. The real losers aren't regime officials who adapt. They're ordinary people in Caracas, in Houston, in Shenzhen, who pay higher prices for energy that now travels longer routes through more middlemen. Here's the unexpected truth. The United States and China both benefit from maintaining this tension. Washington gets to look tough on Venezuela without actually changing the regime. Beijing gets to position itself as an alternative partner for countries tired of American conditions. Both powers use the confrontation to rally domestic support, to justify military spending, to frame themselves as defenders against foreign aggression. The people who don't benefit are everyone else. Dr. Helena Vargas from Part 2. The Brazilian economist who discovered how American financial pressure works through informal channels has a phrase for this. Managed conflict, she calls it. Competition that's intense enough to justify defense budgets and nationalist rhetoric, but controlled enough that it never disrupts elite interests. They're not trying to win, she told me. They're trying to maintain a game that serves them both. Picture a map of the Caribbean with arrows showing oil flows, official routes, sanctioned routes, gray market routes that weave through intermediaries. The arrows don't stop. They just get more complicated, passing through more hands, generating more fees, while the underlying trade continues. The Monroe Doctrine isn't being defended, it's being monetized. And the cost of that monetization is about to come, due not in diplomatic cables or naval standoffs, but in the lives of millions of people who never chose to be caught in the middle of a great power competition that serves everyone except them. The Monroe Doctrine isn't being defended. It's being monetized, and the cost of that monetization doesn't arrive as a single catastrophe. It accumulates slowly, invisibly, like rust on a bridge unnoticed, until the weight of traffic reveals what was lost while everyone looked elsewhere. Systems don't collapse, they erode. And the erosion of American hemispheric dominance will be measured not in naval battles or diplomatic crises, but in the quiet decisions of millions of people who gradually stop assuming that Washington's rules are the only rules. Let me show you what the next decade looks like for the people caught in this transition. Carlos Mendez was 31 in 2024, an engineer at Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA. His salary converted to dollars at black market rates was approximately $47 per month, down from what would have been $1,200 a decade earlier before sanctions and economic collapse. He stayed because leaving meant abandoning his aging parents. By 2034, if current trajectories hold, Carlos will be 41. PDVSA will have pivoted almost entirely toward Chinese partnerships. His salary, paid partly in yuan, will have risen to roughly $340 monthly. Better than the crisis years, but still a fraction of what Venezuelan engineers earned when American companies dominated the oil sector. His skills will be calibrated to Chinese equipment and Chinese technical standards. His future will be oriented toward Beijing, not Houston. Not because he chose China, but because America chose to sanction him out of options. Picture a chart showing Venezuelan oil exports over 20 years, the line that once flowed predominantly toward American refineries, now bending steadily eastward, crossing an inflection point around 2026, where China becomes the permanent majority customer. Now let me show you who wins from that same transition. Li Xiaoming was 33 in 2024, a project manager at China National Petroleum Corporation in Beijing. His job was to oversee logistics for Venezuelan crude shipments, navigating the sanctions, coordinating with intermediaries, solving the problems that American pressure created. By 2034, Li will be 43. The sanctions evasion infrastructure his team built will have matured into permanent shipping routes. His department, once a small crisis response unit, will have grown into a major division managing $15 billion in annual energy imports from Latin America. His bonus that year will exceed $180,000 wealth, built directly on the opportunities that American sanctions created. Carlos and Li will never meet. They exist in parallel worlds, connected only by the oil that flows from one to the other. But their trajectories reveal the underlying logic of this competition. Sanctions don't stop trade, they redirect it. And the redirection benefits those positioned to profit from new routes, while punishing those trapped in the transition. Here's the first question you need to carry forward. If American policy is making Carlos poorer and Li richer, what exactly is being accomplished? What most people get wrong about long-term consequences is imagining them as dramatic breaking points. The reality is duller and more devastating. Power shifts not through explosions, but through accumulation, 1,000 small decisions, each one rational in the moment, that collectively add up to a transformed world. Remember Helena Vargas from Part 2, the Brazilian trade economist, who discovered how American financial pressure works through informal bank channels. She's been tracking what she calls the slow pivot, the gradual reorientation of Latin American trade away from American dependence. In 2015, the United States was the largest trading partner for 12 Latin American countries. By 2024, that number had dropped to 7. By her projections, it will be 4 by 2034. Not because anyone declared a break with Washington, because Chinese demand, Chinese investment, and Chinese infrastructure simply became more attractive. The contrast case that illuminates this trajectory is Indonesia. In 1997, Indonesia faced an economic crisis that required IMF intervention. American conditions were attached: austerity measures, market liberalization, structural reforms. The population suffered enormously. A decade later, Indonesia had recovered, but the memory remained. American-led institutions impose painful conditions in exchange for help. When China offered infrastructure investment through the Belt and Road Initiative, Indonesia compared offers. Chinese loans came with fewer conditions. Chinese projects came with Chinese workers and Chinese equipment, but they also came without lectures about governance. By 2024, Chinese investment in Indonesia exceeded $20 billion. Indonesia still trades with America, still maintains security relationships with Washington, but the gravitational center of its economic future has shifted. Venezuela is following the same path, not by choice, but by exclusion. Adriana Rojas still remembers the exact moment she understood her children's future would not include America. She was 44, a middle school principal in Maracaibo, sitting in her small apartment in 2024, reviewing university options for her 17-year-old daughter, before sanctions. Ambitious Venezuelan students dreamed of American universities. Miami, Houston, Boston. Visa restrictions, financial isolation, and currency collapse had made that impossible. Adriana's daughter was applying to universities in Shanghai and Beijing schools, offering scholarships specifically targeting Latin American students from sanctioned countries. "She'll learn Mandarin instead of English," Adriana said quietly. "Her network will be Chinese. Her opportunities will be Chinese. In 20 years, she'll think in Chinese." This is not cultural conquest. It's market response. When one door closes, people find others. And a generation of Venezuelans is growing up oriented toward Beijing because Washington made itself inaccessible. The strategic implications compound over decades. By 2034, industry analysts project that China will import approximately 4 million barrels of Venezuelan crude daily, roughly triple current levels. Chinese companies will operate the majority of Venezuela's producing oil fields. Chinese-built refineries will process Venezuelan heavy crude for Asian markets. The infrastructure will be Chinese-designed, maintained by Chinese-trained engineers, financed by Chinese banks. At that point, American sanctions become almost meaningless. The entire supply chain will exist outside American jurisdiction. The dollar-denominated financial system won't matter because the transactions won't touch it. Here's the second question that should reframe your understanding. At what point does a policy designed to isolate an adversary become a policy that isolates yourself? The unexpected truth is that American dominance in the Western Hemisphere depended less on military power than on being the best option available. For decades, America was the largest market, the most advanced technology partner, the deepest capital pool. Countries aligned with Washington because alignment paid. That calculation is changing, not because America weakened dramatically, but because China strengthened sufficiently to offer alternatives. And every sanction, every seized tanker, every financial restriction accelerates the search for those alternatives. Remember Commander Sarah Mitchell from Part 3, the Coast Guard officer who realized she was enforcing market share rather than principles. By 2034, if she's still serving her mission, will have transformed. The tanker interdictions will have largely ended, not because policy changed, but because the tankers will be traveling routes that never enter American accessible waters. The gray market infrastructure built to evade sanctions will have matured into permanent alternative systems. She'll patrol a Caribbean that still looks the same, but operates entirely differently. Here's a timeline visualization, 2024. America interdicting tankers, imposing costs, maintaining pressure. 2027. China completing alternative payment systems that bypass dollar clearing. 2030. Latin American countries routinely invoicing in yuan for commodity exports. 2034. The Monroe Doctrine effectively suspended not by declaration, but by irrelevance. The winners of this transition aren't in Washington or Beijing. They're the intermediaries, the infrastructure builders, the professionals who profit from complexity. James Chen from Part 3, the Singapore compliance officer who explained that sanctions are really just tolls, will see his industry flourish. By 2034, the sanctions navigation sector will be a mature institutionalized part of global trade, employing tens of thousands, generating billions in fees, transforming prohibition into premium pricing. The losers are everyone caught between powers. Rosa Delgado's grocery store in Caracas closed in 2021. Her children left Venezuela for Colombia in 2023. By 2034, her grandchildren will be growing up in Bogotá, speaking Spanish with Colombian accents, their connection to Venezuela, a fading memory. She lost her country to a competition she never joined. Marcus Thompson, the Houston refinery supervisor, took his pay cut in 2024. By 2034, he'll be 63, calculating whether he can afford to retire. His pension fund invested in American energy companies will have underperformed Chinese competitors for a decade. His career trajectory bent downward the moment policy decided that controlling Venezuelan oil mattered more than processing it. The system doesn't collapse. It just stops working for the people it was supposed to serve. And the question nobody in power seems to be asking is whether any of this is making anyone safer, more prosperous, or more free, or whether we're all just paying the cost of a competition that benefits the competitors while impoverishing everyone else. That question leads us to where we stand right now in this moment, when the choices being made today will determine which version of the future actually arrives. The system doesn't collapse. It just stops working for the people it was supposed to serve. And the question nobody in power seems to be asking is whether any of this competition is making anyone safer, or whether we're all paying the cost of a game that only benefits the players. Let me bring you back to where we started. The Bella 1 is no longer in the Caribbean. After days of standoff, it completed its journey. Venezuelan crude delivered to Chinese refineries. American interdiction orders unfulfilled, the gap between announcement and execution exposed for anyone paying attention. The tanker has since been renamed, reflagged, absorbed into the gray market fleet that moves sanctioned oil across oceans, while lawyers and compliance officers extract their fees at every port. Captain Luis Mendoza, the Venezuelan tanker commander from Part 1, who watched American patrol boats withdraw after 6 hours of circling, has a new assignment. He now captains vessels on the China route, exclusively longer journeys, better pay, less risk of interdiction. When I asked him what changed, he laughed quietly. "Nothing changed," he said. "We just stopped pretending the old rules still applied." That phrase captures something essential about this moment. The rules haven't been rewritten. They've been revealed as suggestions enforceable against the weak, negotiable for the strong, and profitable for those who understand the difference. Here's the pattern that connects everything we've examined. In Part 1, we saw the paradox: American power announced, but not enforced. In Part 2, we traced the mechanism dollar dominance as a weapon that accelerates its own obsolescence. In Part 3, we exposed the reality: sanctions that don't stop trade, but redirect it toward those positioned to profit. In Part 4, we projected the trajectory: a decade of slow erosion that transforms the map, while everyone watches the headlines. The pattern is consistent. Policies designed to isolate adversaries instead create opportunities for alternatives. Pressure intended to force compliance instead accelerates the search for escape routes. And the costs always inevitably flow downward to people who never made the decisions that shaped their options. Picture a world map with trade routes animated over time: 2015, 2020, 2025, 2030. Watch the arrows shift. Watch the flows redirect. Watch the centers of gravity move. The change isn't dramatic in any single year. It's cumulative, relentless, and by the time it becomes obvious, it's already irreversible. Zheng Wei, the logistics manager in Shenzhen, whose company rerouted Venezuelan oil through intermediaries to avoid American tracking, has been promoted. His expertise in sanctions navigation is now a corporate asset. His team has tripled in size. When we spoke again, he offered an observation that stayed with me. Americans think in terms of winning and losing. We think in terms of patience. You don't defeat a wall by running into it. You walk around it, and eventually everyone forgets the wall was supposed to matter. That patience is China's strategic advantage. Not military power, the United States still dominates there. Not economic size, America remains the largest economy by most measures. But temporal orientation. Beijing plans in decades. Washington plans in election cycles. And when those time frames collide, the longer view usually wins. Here's the first question you should ask yourself in the competition you're watching. Who is playing for next quarter's results, and who is playing for the next generation's position? The unexpected truth is that this confrontation may serve both powers more than it serves anyone else. Washington gets to demonstrate resolve, justify defense spending rally, domestic support against a foreign rival. Beijing gets to position itself as a defender of sovereignty, an alternative to American conditions, a partner for countries tired of being told what to do. The confrontation itself becomes the product useful for both sides, costly for everyone in between. Remember Rosa Delgado, whose grocery store in Caracas went dark when sanctions made imports impossible. Remember Marcus Thompson, the Houston refinery supervisor who took a $23,000 pay cut when Venezuelan crude stopped flowing. Remember Elena Vargas tracking the slow pivot of Latin American trade away from American dependence. They don't appear in strategic analyses. They don't testify before congressional committees. They just absorb the consequences of decisions made in rooms they'll never enter. This is not a video about who's right. It's a video about how power actually operates, not through the stories we're told, but through the mechanisms we're not supposed to notice. Let me offer you a framework. Not investment advice. Not political prescription. Just 3 questions to carry with you when you encounter stories like this one. First, when a policy is announced, ask who pays the cost and who collects the benefit. Follow the money, not the rhetoric. Second, when a confrontation escalates, ask what both sides gain from the escalation itself. Sometimes the fight is the point. Third, when you're told this is about principles, ask what happens to those principles when they conflict with powerful interests. The exceptions reveal the actual rules. Here's the second question that should stay with you. If you can see this pattern clearly, why do the people making these decisions continue as if it's invisible? The answer is uncomfortable. They see it too. They just calculate that the costs fall on people who don't matter to their calculations. Venezuelan families who can't afford food. American workers whose refineries go quiet. Brazilian farmers caught between superpowers they didn't provoke. The pattern continues because the people who pay aren't the people who decide. Commander Sarah Mitchell, the Coast Guard officer, who realized she was enforcing market share rather than principles, requested a transfer last month. She's moving to a different assignment, one where the gap between mission and reality feels less like a daily confrontation with institutional dishonesty. I joined to protect people, she told me. Somewhere along the way, I became a tool for protecting market positions. That's not the same thing. It's not the same thing. And the distance between what we're told and what we're shown is the space where understanding becomes possible. I started this video with a paradox: the most powerful military in history, unable to board a single defiant tanker. That image contains everything you need to know about the current moment. Power is real, but it has limits. Dominance is possible, but it has costs. And the world we're entering, multipolar, contested, uncertain, will be shaped by those who understand where the limits are and who bears the costs. Venezuela is the battleground. China is the target. But the real question isn't who wins this confrontation. The real question is whether anyone in power is counting the people caught in between, or whether they've already decided that some lives are just the price of position. In great power competition, the great powers compete. Everyone else pays the bill.